Just one of you. Sorry. Yeah, so I guess that's kind of similar to what Jeremy was asking. So, what is the actual thing that we are setting in the underlying Win32 APIs? Is it basically we leave it to the default should be false, but in your case, it's given that it's set in the designer most of the time, the designer already has a notion of rendering default values different. I think it's also fine the default happens to be true, right? So if naming wise it helps to name it after what you are doing versus what Windows is doing, then I think that would be better than trying to find a value where the default happens to be false. Yeah.
Quick interjection, emo. I don't think that was the right volume control. Your OBS mixing is wrong.
What is with my OBS mixing?
The audio source that is every other application, because you're the only one that has audio on the YouTube stream.
Really? That seems hard to believe. Can you say something?
Something.
No, that's sure. I mean, according to my monitor, it's working fine. Let me actually check. All right, I'll check YouTube.
So basically what we're saying is that the default value of whatever the default value will be true, and the user will set it to get the. Explicit change for the user to set this property. So I'm just trying to make it clear.
Don't do anything to get your existing behavior.
So the default, the default value for this property would be false or the true. I mean, that will define the property name, basically, right?
I'm not sure I followed what you said.
Okay, so by default, we go with the WinForms behavior. That's what we are agreeing here, right? And the user has to explicitly override this property to get the Windows behavior.
Yes, they have to set false, and then they'll get whatever the default is, and they can
Set false. Okay. Okay. So set false. So the default would be true, and they have to set the false to get the Windows behavior here. Okay. What about the name? Any suggestions on the name? What should be the name here?
I mean, as long as we change anchor top to anchor bottom, it seems fine to me. I'm not a super WinForms person, so I don't know how much it matches the names, but I've done enough that I know what an MDI child window is and what minimizing is and anchors. So it's perfectly self-explanatory as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
The only concern that I had is that the property says the anchor top or something like that. So if tomorrow the Windows changes the behavior instead of the top left, if they started doing the top right or maybe bottom right.
Right, that's why we changed it to anchor bottom.
And take that PR by changing the name.
So So I think naming wise, it's good that it starts with the MDI children prefix because that aligns with the other MDI property. My question is, the MDI children one is in the designer category form versus this one seems to be in something else. I mean, I don't know what this property evaluates to, but you probably want to have this in the same category, right? So when you open the property grid, they both show up in the same, under the same node, right?
Mm-hmm.
Good point.
I mean, I don't know how many people actually browse property grid by category versus alphabetically, but
it's not uncommon.
Yeah. By default, it is category, and they can change it to alphabetically if they want. But normally, sometimes, most of the time, people do it because they don't find the property. They don't know the property name sometimes, or they don't know exact property name or exact category. So they do it alphabetically to figure it out where it is.
Yeah.
So we just need to make sure that it's in the right category to make it make sense.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the right one is. It just seems like MDI children should be in the same, or should be in the same as. All right, so I think
you're sharing notes now, Emo. I don't see them.
No, I'm copy pasting. Here we go.
Okay.
Should have typed as if we were discussing it, but then thank you, and then feel free to drop off, I guess.
Thank you.
Or stay around because this one is also relevant for WinForms. So yesterday.
Yeah, but it's accessibility, so it's my space.
I thought you were about to say it wasn't important.
Yeah, I was about to say that.
It's like the opposite of how it...
And then do a comparison. You basically ask an API and say, is the Windows version at least, this one, right? And then Windows can actually make sure that they do the correct version checks. And so we did the same thing with the operating system APIs. We added in .NET 5, where basically per operating system, we have a, is operating system name version at least, and then you can specify a major, minor, and so on. And so at the same time, there was also this other desire that when you actually log stuff, let's say you send telemetry back to Azure with App Insights or something, you want to know, where your customers are running your applications. And so one of the ways to do that is to say, cool, we give people an API where they can get basically a string that indicates where they're running, but then we don't really document the string, we don't really make any guarantees, and so we basically go out of our way to make it really hard for people to use the string to do version checks. And so that's how we ended up with the runtime information framework description API, which basically gives you, some sort of string, and different frameworks actually return different strings. .NET Framework says .NET space framework, and then I think the version number of them is corlib. On .NET Core, it's .NET now, and then I think also the version of corlib. I think Mono does something else and also includes a commit hash or something. So the syntax of this thing is not like super, uniform. So the accessibility team reached out to us and says, hey, that's cool, but we also need a way to actually, when we walk the UI structure, there's this, I think, UI accessibility framework in Windows, whatever the thing is called, UIA, I think. And they have this thing called framework ID, where you can effectively, or the application can return what toolkit or a technology it used to compose the the UI, right? In WinForms, it's Win32 based. In WPF, it's not. So WPF doesn't even have necessarily Windows handles for everything you control. And so basically, screen readers use this infrastructure to enumerate the controls inside of a UI, right? And so the framework ID property basically allows it to also return, hey, what technology did I use, which allows the screen readers to do something smarter and understand a bit better of what these controls actually are. And so today, the two strings that are returned from this are just WPF and WinForms, which is cool. But now that .NET Framework and .NET Core are drifting further apart because .NET Framework is feature complete, so we don't fix a lot of the accessibility issues in it anymore, because it would break people when we do that. But in .NET Core, we intend to do this, and so now it would be useful for a screen reader to know, well, is this the .NET Core flavor of WinForms, or is it the .NET Framework version of WinForms, right? And then, of course, if you now think about how fast .NET Core evolves, they also have the same problem everybody else has, which is, well, maybe .NET Core version X has a bug, and then you fixed it in .NET Core version Y. So it would be nice for us to know whether you're running on X versus Y, so we can actually make better decisions as well. So long story short, they would like to know the platform plus the version number. So basically, we have two options to deal with that. One way is we could say, hey, we expose, or we use the framework description API to populate that field. That would be very cheap for us to do, obviously. The only real caveat here is that we would say, okay, now we need to document the format of the framework description property, and also make sure that every framework that produces that string, that the string is actually parsable and returned by the framework ID property, right? Those are the two options that I see. And I think I'm leaning towards option 2, not doing a new API, but using environment.version, because framework description would be, it's not impossible to unify the strings, but my gut feel is that if we change the strings, we break some people. But if we don't change the strings, then we make it somewhat harder to parse, right? So that's kind of the trade-offs. I personally don't think, based on the conversation we had with Dave Tryon, that we actually need to know the platform version, because by definition, whatever we do is only done for .NET 6. So if the string includes a version number, you're obviously running on .NET 6 and higher, right? So you're not running on .NET Framework, right? .NET Framework would probably continue to return whatever it returns today, which is just WinForms or just WPF. And this way, you're running on .NET Framework. Would that work?
It seems like it should from my end, though we also will have that extra step to make sure that we change how we populate that field and get agreement from all of our partners about how we present that value now, because that could be that somebody could be dependent.
The UIA has a bunch of properties that are fine. They're just integers with a type, and then you understand how to interpret that type, gotcha. Right? And so we just add a new integer that says, okay, this one is going to give you the enhanced property information or the enhanced version information.
Yeah, so that's the thing I didn't understand. So who owns this description? Is that owned by Windows?
I think so.
Yep, that's my understanding.
And so we can actually ask them to just add a new property for us?
We can ask. There's usually a pretty long tail on that, though, as far as getting it in.
Yeah, I can imagine. And then, of course, it only ships in whatever the next version of Windows is, right? So if you're running on 7, you're still screwed.
Yep, that's true.
I mean, this is the other option we have, is we could just say, hey, WinForms basically just changes the value of the framework ID property, and then we basically have an app compat switch that you can turn off, or that you can turn on, that turns the behavior to the to the current behavior, right? So if you're actually broken by that, you could do that.
That's reasonable.
I mean, the nice thing with that is that it's we can support it on Win 7 out of the gate. We don't have to wait for Windows to catch up, basically. But
Yep.
we can also say Windows can in parallel also add the new property, and then that's also not a bad idea, right? Like it seems to me that if the framework ID is this compound string, we're probably not the only framework that would like to also include other things like version information or I don't know other properties, right, which might make sense for them to expose in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, I see the UIA runtime ID property. It looks like it's supposed to be an array of ints. Turns out so is system.version. So just splatting the version in that one if you're not already using it might be an answer, but maybe it's not consumed in the right way.
So which one were you looking at?
Runtime ID.
Yeah, runtime ID has a different meaning here, but the concept of returning an array of ints would certainly be possible.
Yeah, I found a table that, going back to our previous thing, listed them by category. And under identification, we have automation, class name, framework, labeled by, name, process ID, runtime ID, and native window handle.
Gotcha.
Use that last one. It's probably not important.
Yeah, it seems to me like, that's, I guess, for Mary and Dave to decide. I mean, from our point of view, I think we could just say, environment.version is the API that you're looking for, right? Because it's obviously parsable. We generally stand behind the data that it returns. It's a 4-digit version number, so you can decide whether you return all 4 or just the first 2 or the first 3, depending on how much information you want to expose. It probably, I'm pretty confident that it returns qualib. So you have probably the same issue that you always have with servicing, right? If somebody opted into servicing of .NET Core via Microsoft Update,